Welcome to the Lore Tours of Intergalactic Aerospace Expo 2951. This is where I walk the floor of IAE and tell you all about the history of the ships on display and their creators. Now join me on the floor for your tour. Welcome to the floor. It's Aegis Day. Aegis Dynamics. Who are they? What ships do they make? What are their ships' histories? I'm here to tell you that. Aegis Dynamics was founded in 2532, many years ago. It's one of the older ship companies that's still around. And it's actually a merger between a Davian-based Aegis macrocomputing, Davian-based dynamic production systems, and Earth-based Aegis macrocomputing. Dynamic production systems had space docks, shipyards built all over the UNE, and Aegis macrocomputing did a lot of big, heavy systems. And together they decided to form a larger company specifically to build military ships. Aegis Dynamics, from its inception, was a military manufacturer. You see, the UNE had existed for some time before this, but they were mostly using ships that were built by the individual nations or planets that had existed before the UNE's formation. And they needed some updates. They needed some unifications to streamline their productions, or streamline their logistics, to make things easier to build, to maintain, and so on and so forth. So Aegis stepped forward as a brand new company to help fill that role. And they managed to differentiate themselves from their competitors at RSI because they talked to the people who flew the ships. That became their real bread and butter, talking to the starmen and marines who would use the facilities, use the ships that they were building, and getting to know what they wanted in a ship, and then building that, which has allowed for these ships to really stand the test of time, some of them being 300, 400 years old at this point. So, without further ado, let's get started. Well, I also forgot to mention, Aegis's prolific production of military ships has also put them onto a bit of a controversial path with their close ties with the fascist regime of the Mezzers. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to those ships. But let's get started with the Sabre. Over here we have the Aegis Dynamics Sabre. This was built in 2945 during a competition labeled the Next Generation Fighter. Now, there is another similar named program that happened actually in the 2930s, which led to the F8 being created. They're essentially the same name competition, only 10 years apart. So I think this may be just an issue of lore not really lining up properly, because under that, Aegis released a ship they called the Dogfighter 3000, and we talked about that during RSI Day, as RSI released what they called the RSI Black Widow, which I believe is the Scorpius. I believe the Dogfighter 3000 is in fact the Sabre. So it was built specifically with that in mind. With that most likely being the case, the Sabre was built as a competitor to the F8 and specifically designed to combat Vanduul fighters, heavy Vanduul fighters. As you can see, it is equipped with lots and lots of guns and stowaway missile compartments in here as well. You don't see any exterior missiles as well. Meaning it was stealthy, sleek, and fast. This ship was also the first of the Aegis ships to essentially just go straight from production and bidding for military contracts to civilians as well. The Sabre rolled off the assembly line and it was immediately being offered to civilians before the actual decision of the Next Generation Fighter contest bid was decided. So the Sabre has a prolific usage in militias as well as in the UEE. Even though it didn't win the competition, it is still used by UEE pilots, as we've seen in several videos of Squadron 42. This brings us to a variant. During a specific don't remember the exact date of it, but there was a promotion run by Origin Systems, which specifically, the makers of Arena Commander, to release variants for their in-game Arena Commander game ships. And these were also produced as limited quantities for out-of-game real life. Kind of a joint promotion. And so they promoted, they kind of worked with several companies specifically for this. We've talked a little bit about this, I think, in the past with the Wildfire was one of those promotions. This is another one of those. Known as the Saber Comet, it is the livery and guns of one... Why am I not seeing his name? Of one... Kamor Dalion. Now, Kamor Dalion was a close friend and confidant of Ivor Mezer, who served with him during the First Tavaran War. He was also a very good pilot, and was the lead test pilot for Aegis for many years, directing Aegis towards how to build fighters. He's one of the major movers and shakers that would eventually lead to the development of the Gladius and other such fighters, which have become iconic in the UEE. But this, the one ship that he helped design from the ground up was known as the Aegis Comet. Now, the Comet was never actually flown as a combat ship. It never really made the grade. But he would continue to work with it and work with the companies to help them learn how to make fighters. And the Sabre is essentially the final culmination of all of his work, being with a lot of what happened, what went into the Comet hundreds of years ago, being kind of pulled out of mothballs and reintroduced with new ideas and designs with the Sabre. Thus, the Comet, the Saber Comet here, is his livery of what he would usually have on his ship, as well as a loadout that was similar to the loadouts he would use when he was doing flight testing. So it'll nod to a very famous pilot in UEE history. And here we've got the Reclaimer. Now, the Reclaimer is... she big, but she hasn't got a lot of history. We don't know who built her. We don't know what she was built for, other than salvage, but I can tell you a little bit of her in-lore specs. This massive claw here, the claw, is called the Massive Multi-Tool Arm, or MMTA. It is designed to grab ships bigger, almost the size of the Connie, and use those grips to either stabilize for drones. It also comes equipped with an array of surveyor-class drones for seeking out valuable items, or to kind of rip it apart and then mulch it into its own processing facility to process scrap. It also comes with a large cargo hold and reclamation equipment to process, as I said, up to a constellation's worth of salvage. It is also got a lot of manned cutters, which are deployed for EVA and recovery operations. This is kind of like a separate little vehicle, which we haven't seen yet. And it bristles with guns, with only requiring, I think, 3 operators to operate all of the guns on the ship. She can be a bit of a battle bus if she wants to. But yeah, she is a very large ship that is almost entirely dedicated to space salvaging. Now let's go over and look a little bit more at its stoic history here. A little bit more of the history of Aegis Dynamics. So here we're going to talk about one of the more recent ships and one of the older ships in Aegis's lineup. Here we have the Gladius, one of the oldest ships ever built by the UEE. It is a light fighter that was designed to replace the aging stiletto fighters built during the First Tavaran War. This vehicle itself, the Gladius, was built after the First Tavaran War, and it has a bit of a history. You see, before the First Tavaran War, most human ships did not have energy shields. In fact, the only ships that had energy shields were very large ships, capital-class ships, that had the power plants to run them. But human energy shields were fairly primitive in comparison to even Tavaran technology. Tavarans were able to miniaturized their own shield tech, and pretty much all of their ships had shields, which meant that they didn't have to rely as much on bulky armor. As a result, light fighters were very, very vulnerable to attacks from their Tavaran counterparts. So they weren't seen as a very good combat frontline operations. They were mostly used for escort vessels and patrol, mostly to keep an eye out for enemy patrols or enemy attacks, and then return back to inform the fleet. But that all changed during an event called the Fall of the Olympus. The UES Olympus was a supercarrier that was commanded by an admiral. Now, I don't have his name. But we do know that the UES Olympus was commanded by an admiral and was sent into the Null system to chase some pirates in 2571. And during this time period, the Olympus, or at this moment, the Olympus was tricked into going too far into a planet, and it could not escape that planet's atmosphere. The planet of, I believe, Ashana. And as it fell into the atmosphere, it broke up and crashed into the planet, killing pretty much all on board. The Olympus had a contingent of what are called Stiletto-class light fighters, well, medium fighters. They're medium interceptors made by the Elio Harmon Aerospace Company, which is now a defunct company in the early 26th century. And the Stilettos were used extensively in the First Tavaran War as escort craft. But they were, and combat air patrol for just warnings. So the last stand of this combat air patrol of Stilettos, after their carrier went down, was broadcast to anybody who could hear them in the UEE. They fought to the last man, doing everything they could to try to save and get any kind of survivors off of the ship, off of the crashed ship, getting them out. And they died to a man. But this heroic sacrifice was seen as propaganda. It was seen as a good thing by the Mezzers, who wanted to promote the heroism of the starmen of the UEE. And the ability of these fighters to last as long as they did, even in such crazy circumstances, and the skills of the pilots who operated them, meant that they wanted to capitalize on both this great moment, but also with this to kind of exploit this light fighter or the interceptor class a little bit more. So they created the Mezzers went to Aegis Dynamics to see if they could make a modern Stiletto with all the technologies they required from the Tavaran Wars, including miniaturized shield tech and all of the best parts of the Stiletto. And what they came up with was the Gladius. Now, the Gladius is a fantastic light fighter. Any pilot in the game, in player or NPC, will tell you that the Gladius is one of the best fighters that humanity has ever built. It's light, it's maneuverable, it packs a punch, but it doesn't take up a lot of space, so it's very easy to transport as a carrier fighter. And because there are so many built, they're just everywhere. Military surplus Gladiuses are everywhere. And you can even find tons of Gladiuses in junkyards everywhere across the entire UEE, possibly even fixing them up yourself if you wanted to. That is, in fact, the story behind the Gladius over here. Now, this is another Masters of Flight series limited edition. This is called the Gladius Valiant. Now, the Valiant was the Gladius owned by Condi Hillard. Now, Condi Hillard wasn't really a pilot, or she was a pilot, but she wasn't really in the Navy. She was a mercenary, and she wanted to get into mercenary work, but needed a ship. So she found an old Gladius in a scrapyard, and then rebuilt it herself to specs that she needed. And then went looking for a job and got hired by a company called the Orion Defense Protection, which was a mercenary company that operated out of the Orion system. ODP, as you can see over here on the tail, and of course right there, was a company that was hired by the UE and the local Orion government to defend against the incoming Vanduul threat. After the first raids of the Vanduul, the UAE sent in a massive fleet to try to discourage any of this new species attacks. And people like the ODP were activated to aid in a lot of this defense. ODP had set up a base in the Orion system, and Condi, who was a recent hire, was leading her patrol of fighters looking for Vanduul ships when they were returning back to base to refuel. And as they were heading back to base, they caught a flight of Vanduul scythes completely unawares. These scythes were already making an attack on their base. So Condi's flight turned, dived on the Vanduul and attacked, driving them away. But in the chaos and confusion of these human ships attacking the Vanduul for the first time, Condi managed to line up a shot and destroy a Vanduul scythe in her Gladius, meaning that she was the first human pilot to ever destroy a Vanduul ship on record. And it was, of course, a Gladius. So in honor of her effort and her skill, the Masters of Flight series released the Condi Hillard's Valiant, which is her livery as well as her loadout that she would have carried, or something similar to the loadout she would have carried on that fateful day. From some of the oldest ships to one of the newer ships, here we have Project Monitor, aka the UEES Hammerheads. Well, the Aegis Dynamics Hammerhead. The Project Monitor was a program in 2756 that they needed for a dedicated anti-fighter platform that could serve as both a key element in a standard fleet screen and as a patrol ship, a cost-effective patrol ship. And Aegis did what they did best. They went out, talked with people who were already serving in these sorts in similar ships to see what they wanted. And specifically the Gween class, aging Gween class patrol ships. And what they came out was the Hammerhead. The Hammerhead was seen as very effective, but it did have some problems. The first flights were a little bit cumbersome to use, but they were approved by 2773. And we see something like 6 or 7 flights because they were seen as very effective. During the fall of the Measures, which was shortly after the first flights had released in 2792 is when the Measures would fall, the new UEE was very distrustful of the Measures of Aegis Dynamics because of their relationship with the Measures. The Measure regime had been brutal, and one of their right-hand companies, the company that would always support them in all of their endeavors, was Aegis Dynamics since the beginning, since Ivor Measure. So they weren't keen on buying new Aegis Dynamics material, and in fact, they were moving away from Aegis Dynamics and towards a new company that was a new kid on the block, which was Anvil Aerospace. So Aegis had to scramble to do something because they had just lost their best client with the Measures, and they were at risk of being charged for even war crimes for their participation in the Measure era, the Measure regime. The only thing that's preventing them not from going so was because they made pretty much every ship in the fleet. And with the UEE modernizing and trying to move away from Aegis Dynamics, that was going to change if they didn't continue to try to get back into the favor of the UEE. So they were lucky because they had not signed an exclusivity contract with the UAE Navy for the Hammerheads. So on a gamble, they released Hammerheads to the civilian market. And it did very well because Aegis Dynamics had a mythological presence about them. I mean, they had made the Gladius, they'd made the Retaliator, they'd made the Vulcan. They had been making, iconic ships that people would remember even today in, 2950, 51. So the Hammerhead was snapped up by the civilian market. And eventually, the UAE would come back and sign for more contracts for more Hammerheads, seeing how effective they were in combat. So, Flight 2, after an incident with the UEES Tibero, which had a collision when it was doing a refuel rearmor operations. That they wanted to do major sensor changes to the Flight 2, which happened in 2817. And then we had the Flight 3s, which is an overall upgrade for command and control surfaces, introduced in 2854 to 2915. In 2947, the Flight 4s came out, which are a more modern version of it, compared to the Flight 3 models, Flight 4. And then Flight 5s, they began early jump development for a theoretical Flight 5, though there is no naval contract in place and is unlikely to service opening in the next decade. So there is a Flight 5, a more up-to-date version of the Hammerhead, which is not in development right now, or is in development but may never actually be built, to try to continue that. So there's multiple versions of the Hammerhead out there, mostly just small tweaks on the interior. But the Hammerhead has proven itself very effective as a fleet screen and as a patrol ship. Several Hammerheads working together have been known to take on Vanduul capital ships and defeat them. They've developed specific fleet maneuvers for Hammerheads to be able to bring all of their guns to bear on one target in large groups, and it has proven effective, but not ideal. But it does allow for this new fleet doctrine of the new UEE to be more flexible and to be reliant on more small capital ships than squadrons of fighters, expensive squadrons of fighters, which require a lot of maintenance and refitting, and large fleets, which require, again, more maintenance and operations, a lot of overhead. So ships like the Hammerhead, the Perseus, the Idris, the Polaris, the Nautilus, these are the kind of the sweet spot that the UEE wants to hit for a lot of its operations in interior patrols. Let's continue on and talk a little bit more about Aegis ships with the Avenger. Here we go with the Aegis Avenger, and I hate it, the Redeemer. We'll go talk a little bit about the Redeemer, but the Redeemer really doesn't have any history right now. So here we have the Aegis Avenger. The Avenger has several different variants, though there is one variant that's missing from the floor, which is the Avenger Trainer, which is a two-seater version of the Avenger. But the Avenger was first developed in 2760, towards the end of the Meser era, and was designed specifically as a medium carrier fighter. And it did its job fairly well, but of course it was not nearly as effective as its future replacement, the Hornet. But it did become a very popular ship, not necessarily amongst the Navy, but amongst the police forces, specifically the advocacy and advocacy agents, as well as bounty hunters. Let me show you why. So it is a ship that has a significant amount of firepower. It's a sleek design, aerodynamic, so it does handle in atmosphere fairly well. It's not very fast or maneuverable, but it makes up for it for being a little bit more tanky, and also for its little bit more modularity. Here we have the Titan variant, which is, just the stripped down, nothing inside here. But if we open the door, there's a bed and possible storage devices in here as well. So this bed had made this fighter from just being a combat carrier fighter to being a long-range fighter patrol ship. And that is what the advocacy uses it for even today. With the different variants, they could allow for various different changes in combat. Here we have the Stalker, which is the standard variant. The Titan is the cut-down variant, which is has just a cargo bay. But the Stalker, open it up, has several cryo bays inside of it to hold prisoners for long-range transportation. You can capture a criminal, throw them in your cryopod, and bring them back to serve justice. And there's even a variant over here called the Warlock, which replaces the back end of cargo bay entirely and replaces it with a bespoke EMP, a very powerful EMP generator. This EMP generator, as you can see here, would be very effective for disabling ships and helping, again, them, multiple agents to do their job pretty effectively. Though it doesn't sacrifice its interior bed either. So you have both, the best of both worlds. Now, the Avenger is getting old, but it is still the premier choice for every advocacy agent. They have attempted to replace the Avenger with M50s, and that didn't work so well, despite what popular belief has believed, many in the public have believed. So the Avenger still has a long service record and will continue to serve with the UEE for a very long time, especially the advocacy. And the Avenger trainers, the two-seater versions, are still used as the primary training platform for new pilots in the UEE Navy. This also leads us to our last Masters of Flight series ship. This is the Aegis Avenger Titan Renegade. Now, this is the ship of Agent Danny Sullivan. He was known for being very, very rash, very gruff. In fact, one of his favorite quotes, I'll pull it up here, was, "Sometimes you need to take a few shots at someone to get them to listen." He was a shoot first, ask questions later kind of guy. And he was also involved, he was the special agent in charge, or SAIC, of the Bremen system. Now, the issue with the Bremen system is that the Bremen system, since forever, has been a hotbed of rebel and smuggler activity. It has many known and historical smuggling routes go through the Bremen system. Thus, any advocacy agent in charge of the Bremen system would have to deal with smugglers. The thing about smugglers, from personal experience, is they like their ships fast and they like to run away. They'd rather not get caught, and they'd rather risk running away than fighting. As a result, Agent Solomon had a problem where he was not able to catch his culprits as often. So he swapped out his Stalker for a Titan, removing the cryo bays entirely. Now, because he was known to fire pretty quick on the trigger, this was led to the belief that he was in fact literally killing people rather than bringing them in. So this gave him the kind of title as the Renegade agent, the Renegade advocacy agent. In reality, the reason why he switched to a Titan was because it was lighter, and he could thus catch a little bit of speed compared to the Stalker and catch up to some of these fleeing criminals. And he didn't need a cryo bay because he had at his back, and as an ally, the Bremen Defense Force, who, if you remember us talking about with Anvil and the Super Hornet, is the best militia in human history. They are very, very good at what they do, and they're very organized. So Solomon could lean on their support to actually come in and take apprehended suspects and bring them back to prison. So he had best of both worlds. Criminals would often surrender to him rather than flee because they didn't want to get killed. But in reality, he wasn't doing that. He would use his resources effectively to be a good agent. So that is the story behind the Titan Renegade. Now let's head on over to talk about the pride of the Marines, the Vanguard series. I realized I didn't talk about the the Redeemer. I honestly, it was an honest mistake, not because I hate that ship. There really isn't a lot of lore behind it. The only thing we know is that it had several delays before it was released, and it possibly is a fairly recent ship, though there is other lore that contradicts that, saying the Redeemer is older than, say, the Starlifter, the Hercules. So we don't really know 100%, unfortunately, but it is a gunship used by the UEE, and it has been said to have been used effectively against the Vanduul. With that being said, though, let's talk a little bit more about the pride of the Marines, the Aegis Vanguards. Now, the Vanguard series started with just the Warden here. Now, the Warden is the fighter variant. A Warden is a long-range escort and kind of scout, exploration, long-range heavy fighter. used for exploration missions, for probing missions, and so on and so forth. But it was very tough. It could go on long-range missions, and it had a lot of firepower. On top of that, Aegis quickly was able to iterate on its development, creating several variants using what they called battlefield upgrade kits, which allowed you to turn a Warden into any number of variants of ships, including a torpedo variant, a EMP and E-warfare variant, and a troop transport variant. So this meant that the Marines who could use these ships for alone, they could essentially take several Vanguards and kit them out to whatever mission they were doing, and these ships would work in tandem. They could go long ranges, defending themselves and as fighters, while also performing fighter bomber roles, also performing transport roles, E-warfare roles, and just escort roles as well. So working together, you would see the Marines sometimes use some, say, a Sentinel, which is over here. These ships were also introduced in 2737. These are, of course, the A3G Vanguards. The Marines would use this ship. No, it's not exclusively used by Marines. I'm highlighting it because Marines are the kind of the best of the UAE. They're the best forces in general, and the fact that they use these ships should tell you a lot about these ships. If they trust their lives to these ships, they're very, very good. They're very, very good. And the Sentinel is designed for wild weasel missions, going in and disrupting and destroying radar installations, sensor installations, and sometimes anti-spacecraft or anti-aircraft installations to open a way for future attacks. So you could see a flight of Marine Vanguards with Sentinels on point, going through a jump point and disabling a sensor network before the rest of the fleet would arrive. Supported by Wardens as their escort fighters, Harbingers as their bombers. Up here you can see those little rocket pods on the top, which indicates it's the Harbinger. The Harbinger actually carries size 5 torpedoes. So not the meanest and baddest ones, but the same kind of complement as, say, an Anvil Gladiator, but with a lot more fighting power with its size 4 guns in the front. So the Harbingers would go in and hit hard targets to soften up areas, and then we have the Hoplite, which would carry up to 6 Marines on board with their full kit, drop them off, and then the Harbingers the Hoplite would then be able to stay on station as ground support and be able to help take out any sort of harder targets. Once their mission had been completed, the Marines could reboard their Hoplites, and the whole flight could head back to UAE space. And since they were all the same types of ships, they had the similar or the same kinds of ranges, which was usually very long, longer than a bomber, or about as long as a Retaliator bomber, but longer than the fighters, but with more of a fighter capabilities and with some hybrid bomber capabilities as well. So it's the perfect flexible attack profile, for perfect flexible space frame for the Marines who need a flexible space frame for their jobs, often involving stealth, high risk, high rewards types of missions. So that's the Vanguards. Now, almost finally, the last ships that are flyable on the floor, we have the bombers of Aegis Dynamics. So here we have let's go with the most recent one, or the oldest one. This is the oldest ship in the Aegis Dynamics lineup, the Aegis Retaliator. Now, the Retaliator was built, as I said before, by talking with with bomber crews of various ships and asking them what they wanted in a bomber, and the result was the Retaliator. It was seen extensive use in the First Tavaran War, both in the Battle of Idris IV, as well as bombing raids onto the homeworld of the Tavaran themselves. But during the Battle of Idris 4, Retaliators were used by one Ivor Mezer. During the invasion of Idris 4 to the liberation of Idris 4 from the Tavaran, the human forces were in a bad way. They started off fairly successful, and ground forces were able to form a toehold onto a spaceport, but quickly they were getting surrounded and almost overrun, with one after another their commanding officers dropping, until one Captain Ivor Mezer of a UEE infantry group, it's a EU infantry group, because this is the UNE still, took command of the invasion force and essentially rallied the remaining forces, managed to get hold of bomber command, and had bombers practically drop bombs on their own position. And these were Retaliator bombers. And how skilled these Retaliator bombers were, they were able to pinpoint strike Tavaran assaults while doing minimal or no damage to the UEE positions. So round-the-clock bombing to break the back of the Tavaran helped win the war, basically, the big tide change, and made Ivor Mezer a war hero. So Aegis Dynamics not only saved the lives of his men, and saved the entirety of humanity, but made Ivor Mezer who he was. So Aegis Dynamics and Ivor Mezer grew very close after the war, and as Ivor Mezer began to rise the ranks, eventually seizing power as the quote-unquote prime citizen, and eventually the first imperator of the UEE, his new creation, Aegis Dynamics was along for the ride, becoming the major manufacturer for all military needs of the UEE, which is why there's so many Aegis ships out there, and why most Aegis ships weren't built, but were built before the fall of the Mezers. A handful of ships, like the Sabre and the Eclipse, what we'll talk about right now, were built after the Mezer regime. So most of its ships were built because of the Mezers, which is why they got in such hot water when the Mezer regimes eventually fell, because they were seen as war criminals, accessories to war crime, accessory to genocide in many cases. And so they had to walk a very tight line. But the oldest ship in Aegis's fleet is also the reason why Aegis was able to survive. They couldn't rely on military contracts after the fall of the Mezers, and as the Hammerhead did well, so did the Retaliator, but with a very different type of enthusiast. The Retaliator has two bomb bays, one in the front and one in the back. These are very sizable bays used for torpedoes, but civilians would buy aftermarket or military surplus Retaliators for very cheap, and then gut out the interiors and replace them with bars, making bars, drop ships, entertainment centers, larger like crew transports. The custom Retaliator market was exploding in the early 29th century because of how cheap the Retaliators were becoming, as they would sell more and more surplus Retaliators to the civilian market. And this is what eventually allowed for the kind of changed Aegis's stars, becoming more interested in selling their older ships to the civilian market than developing brand new ships, and in some cases expanding the reach of their civilian, more civilian-oriented ships to get into more hands of more people. So the Retaliator is not only the thing that made Aegis Dynamics who they were, it also saved them many later. Now, this is a bit of a controversial ship. This is the Eclipse. Now, Project Eclipse was created by, what was the Imperator? Imperator Coley. Now, Imperator Coley was an Imperator in the mid-30th, in like 2920s. So well after the end of the Mezer era, and well after the establishment of peace with the Xi'an. But Coley feared that the Cold War between the humanity and the Xi'an was going to reignite. So, secretly, he created a program for a stealth bomber, something that would give them an edge if there was a new Cold War, which he felt was brewing. Now, This became the Aegis Eclipse, who was the only company willing to work on such strict secret circumstances. The military would first introduce the Eclipse into military service in 2932, where it saw extensive use against the Vanguard, being a ship that could strike at targets without being seen from a long distance away and get away before any of those ships could respond, being used as a first strike option, effectively. Now, it was declassified in the 2947, I believe. In 2947, under the Historical Truth Act and the Militia Mobilization Initiative that kind of revealed its existence, which was top secret before this, and was allowed to be sold to various militias and civilians who had the right authorizations. So that is the Eclipse. It's not nearly as potent as the Retaliator, but it has the same sort of firepower. I believe only 2 size 9s rather than the 4 or 6 that the Retaliator can carry. So it has less firepower, but what it lacks in firepower, it makes up in stealth, being able to strike a target before anyone could even see it. All right, let's finish this off with looking at the future ships of Aegis Dynamics, the ones that are not quite out yet, but have been around the UAE for some time. Here we have the display hall. We're going to see some hollows of future ships that have yet to be released in Star Citizen, but are usually fairly old in terms of the universe itself. Here we have the Aegis Vulcan. Now, the Vulcan, look at my notes real quick, was first released in 2594. This ship was designed specifically for a growing problem that the Mezzers were realizing still existed in the new UEE. As the UNE had expanded its reach into space and the UPE began to kind of reorganize the government, it still lacked a lot of infrastructure, especially in more remote systems. This meant that the military was more reliant on very tenuous supply lines that would stretch from more civilized systems all the way out to remote systems, and it was very expensive to build infrastructure deep into space. So to fill in a stopgap, the Mezzers asked for Aegis for a kind of flying resupply logistics ship, which would become the Vulcan. Now, the Vulcans uses drones to be able to resupply, repair, and refuel fighters and larger ships on the fly. It can't hold a ton, but a lot of these together can specialize. One specializing in repair, one specializing in refueling, and one specializing in rearming. They can do pretty well in terms of doing a fleet tender, helping the fleet stay afloat, especially since the Mezzers more preferred to rely on large groups of fighters and bombers as defense screens for their growing empire. Now, this problem with logistics and infrastructure wasn't just a military problem. The civilians had problems with this as well. And that's where the United Wayfarers Club comes in. It's kind of like the space version of AAA. It's a group of space enthusiasts who wanted to increase the amount of people who were flying and also to help people who were in need, running out of fuel, caught on the drift, what have you. And they were using civilian modified ships to do this role. But when the Vulcan came out, they came up with an unorthodox request and asked the Aegis Dynamics if they could buy a fleet of Vulcans for their own use, which was never happened really before this. So the Aegis had to ask the UAE, and the Mezzers, seeing this as a boon to social side of things, to kind of a political win, approved it. So the United Wayfarers Club had their own fleet of Vulcans to use as rescue ships to aid ships that run out of fuel or needed rearming or needed repair if they got caught in some sort of storms or other accidents. Thus being the first Aegis ship to be widely available to the civilian market as well as the military. And it's even being used today by groups like Xi'an-based CTR and other ships and other companies like it who to kind of help stranded travelers in their spaceships. From ultra-civilian to top-secret submarine in space, the Nautilus. The the Aegis Dynamics Nautilus, the first one being the UES Nautilus, was a top-secret mine layer developed after the First Tavaran War, similar to the Retaliator. The Aegis Dynamics went to mine people who served on mine layers during the First Tavaran War and asked them what they wanted for a dedicated mine layer, because mines were seen as a very effective tool in space combat, being able to deny or direct forces to one place or another. And these starmen would kind of give their own ideas, and those ideas would become the Nautilus. The Nautilus was a top-secret ship. It was not even identified to exist outside of those crews who served on it and those commanders, those fleet commanders who knew about it. And it was used very effectively in very clandestine activities, often going behind enemy lines or going, for instance, being active in the Battle of Centauri, which was the end of the Second Tavaran War, dropping mines to lead the Tavaran fleet away directly to the jump point where Squadron 42 would ambush the fleet. It was also used in the recent Battle of Oberon to cut off retreating Vanduul ships, to completely destroy and devastate the Vanduuls to prevent them from being able to flee out of the victorious Navy assault. But its probable most famous use, at least historically, is during its first ever deployment during the standoff at Hador. Now, during the early days of the Mezer regime, the Mezers had been using the Xi'an to whip up anti-xenophobic feelings and to promote their own power. And part of this was to an increased military buildup along the human-Xi'an border. And Ivor Mezer was convinced that the Xi'an were going to start a war with humanity and wanted the ability to defend himself and get high, up-to-the-minute intel with the goings-on the Xi'an front. Sorry, itchy nose. So, a trusted advisor of his created a top-secret, highly classified, or highly experimental sensor buoy beacon to place along the Peri line, the border between human and Xi'an space. It didn't work, but that didn't stop the this close confidant of the Mezers to kind of assure the Mezers that it should work, and it didn't work, and it exploded after it was placed. The first one was placed in the system of Hador. This explosion was registered by a UAE patrol, most likely of Perseus's, who then approached the debris field of this destroyed beacon and found Xi'an ships scanning the wreckage, refusing the hails of any UAE ships. Then it took the commander of this patrol to fire a shot across the bow of one of these ships after multiple attempts at hailing them that got the Xi'an to back off of the debris. Immediately contacting the local admiral of the fleet, the admiral of the local fleet of the UAE, the admiral brought in his forces, gathered everything he could, and rushed to Hador, knowing that this situation could go from bad to worse if things continued to escalate, hoping that a show of force might cause the Xi'an to back off a little bit. He also wanted to know what the heck happened to the sensor beacon and if the Xi'an were involved. The creator of the beacon, who was there at the time, insisted that the Xi'an must have done some tampering, but he wasn't too sure, so asking for more and more sensor sweeps until they could get some data. In the meantime, however, the admiral knew that the Xi'an would not sit behind their lines while a UAE fleet would form up into neutral space. So he ordered his first Nautilus, before the Nautilus was even approved for active use, to lay mines across the jump point from Xi'an space to human space. But before it could finish, the Xi'an fleet arrived. Luckily, the Xi'an were more curious and intrigued by this weird ship they'd never seen, shadowing it and scanning it, rather than attacking it. So the Nautilus was allowed to finish laying its mines and then retreated back to rearm its mines for future use. This delayed the fleet, the Xi'an fleet, from approaching, though they weren't really interested in approaching anyways. As the UAE fleet finally, as the UAE Navy fleet finally discovered the data they needed to, the admiral ordered all its forces to pull back And eventually the Xi'an would come scan the debris and, leave as well after the fact. The UAE found out that the reason why it exploded was a bad reactor. It just wasn't ready for use. It wasn't a practical device, and it was entirely the developer's fault, the developer who was close friends with the Mezzers. Ivor Mezzer was furious at the Admiral for what he did, especially by deploying the Nautilus, but as more information came out, he began to realize that his old friend was just bad. She did not know what she was doing, but the Admiral did everything exactly correct. And hailed him as a hero, and he grew closer with the Admiral. So he became quite a well-known figure in the Navy for acting with restraint, but with an appropriate amount of force to continue to kind of keep the Xi'an on their toes, to keep them more worried. And so now, today, the Nautilus is available for anyone. It's over 400 years old, 402 years old. And its purpose is still laying mines, though it does also have its own Nemo drone, which is designed to deactivate mines and then recover those mines, because many places along the Perry Line are still covered in mines from the Xi'an-human Cold War. So its still also job is not just to deploy mines, but also deactivate and retrieve older mines, which can be more unstable and or more vulnerable to passing trade as human and Xi'an relations expand to more trade offers. The last thing that the UAE needs is a stray mine from the Mezzer era blowing up a important Xi'an transport full of goods heading for human space. So the Nautilus is still used extensively for top secret operations, but also for these more mine clearing operations to make sure that areas are clean for commercial travel. And that is us for today here at Aegis Day for IAE 2951. Remember, if you enjoy this, hit that like button. It helps spread the word of what we do here at the Astropub, especially the Galactic Historian stuff. If you're interested, we do Galactic Historian videos. I've done over 100 videos of various different types talking about the lore of Star Citizen. Please check that out as well. If you want to see the previous episodes I've done of the previous days, you can do that as well. These are all fairly longer. They're more off the cuff, whereas my regular videos my regular Galactic Historian videos are shorter, but they're a little bit more tighter. Yeah, you can also join us live on Twitch, twitch.tv/theastropub, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. We do gameplay of Star Citizen. We do discussions. We have our Captain's Table podcast on Saturdays. And you're also willing to come join us and play with us as well. So, like I say every time, and I keep screwing that up, remember, ex historia ad astra.